and welcome to today's topic, personality. We all got one. We want to become more self-aware so we can have a better understanding of ourselves, which will in turn help us understand others. Today's information primarily comes out of Weinberg and Gould's Foundation of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 7th edition. Our learning objectives for this module are to be able to describe and define personality. We're going to use the schematic structure of personality to do that. We want to be able to identify personality viewpoints and the big 5 personality traits and how they relate to behavior. We also are going to be able to describe the paradox of perfectionism, along with being able to discuss what this research on perfectionism and on personality can tell us about our behavior and performance. Okay, so let's begin with defining personality. What is it? Well, we're all probably pretty aware. We're all very unique and we all have very unique characteristics. And within these characteristics, we have those characteristics that are very stable and we have those that are more dynamic. So we're going to talk about the different layers or the different levels of our personality so we can kind of break it down to kind of have a better understanding, one, of ourselves and then again of others. Okay, so there's 3 basic layers to the structure of personality. We have our psychological core, our typical responses, and then our role-related behavior. So what is our psychological core? Well, those are the morals and the beliefs and the attitudes that have developed in us from the beginning of our time here on Earth. Now, these all deal with, whether you were raised in a religious or non-religious home, a political, non-political home, what kind of core values did your parents raise you with? All those kind of things are what's built into us as our core personality. So that's our psychological core. The next level is our typical response. And this really relates to how we interact with our environment, right? What is your typical response to standing in a crowded line? What is your typical response to being in traffic, right? These are the kind of things that, depend largely on, are you introverted or extroverted? Are you shy or outgoing? Are you typically calm, cool, and collected, or are you nervous and neurotic and anxious? Those are all kind of different things that we identify as personalities, and this is where we have that typical response. So if typically a coach were to, get on your case for something, do you stand up and kind of, say, okay, I'm going to take that as critical, as a constructive criticism and move on, or do you cower in that and you feel berated and you lose self-confidence? Those are some typical responses. And then we have our role-related behavior. And our role-related behavior really deals with the different hats that we wear throughout the day. Now, for instance, I wear an instructor hat, I wear a coach hat, I wear a parent hat, I wear a husband hat, I wear a friend hat, all within the same day. And generally speaking, you're going to have, or I don't vary that much in my behavior, but for instance, I don't go home and try to be a coach to my kids, right? I don't try to coach my wife. Those kind of things are left for a specific role I have. I tend to, want to be the dad and the father and the fun-loving, playful guy with my kids. And with my wife, I want to be loving and caring and helpful and those kind of things. So those are the kinds of role-related behaviors that you can see are most dynamic. So now looking at these 3 levels or 3 layers of our personality, we can go and discuss how our psychological core is our constant and most stable part of our being and part of our personality. Our typical response is, a little more dynamic. It can change over time and usually does with maturity. And then our role-related behavior is our most dynamic part of our personality. And it's also the most external. It's the part that most people will see, because oftentimes you can put on a happy face, even though if internally you're not feeling great for the day. But oftentimes, for instance, in a job where you're coaching, you have to bring the energy. You may not feel energetic that day, but man, it's so important that your team feels your energy, so you bring the energy, even though you might have had a really bad day in other ways. So again, looking at this schematic from bottom to top, it's stable at our psychological core and more dynamic at our role-related behavior. Our psychological core is really internal to us, whereas the role-related behavior is the external and the part that is seen by lots of people. So that's how we can look at the structure of our personality. All right, now that we have a better understanding and being able to define personality and seeing it in a schematic structural way, let's take a dive into the viewpoints of personality, right? The most common and most widely accepted viewpoint is going to be the interactional approach. However, in studying personality over the years, psychologists have looked at many different viewpoints, and there's six major ones. We're going to highlight three of those today. But as you can see, even in this image here, on this continuum, we see the parts that are internally determined and more environmentally determined. So just to kind of give you an idea of some terminology, we have the psychodynamic approach, the trait approach, interactional approach, phenomenological approach, and situational approach. Now today we're going to take a look at the trait, interactional, and situational approaches, just to kind of give us an idea of how they can, how they're defined, how they can help us understand behavior, and then kind of what are the best practices. Let's take a look at the trait approach. The key point to the trait approach that dominated the early studies of personality basically did not consider that situations had much of an impact on the behavior of an individual. This approach basically contends that the behavior of an individual is determined by their stable trait personality, in turn, meaning that they are predisposed to act in certain ways regardless of the situation. So, how does this look, or how do we maybe think about behavior in this situation? Well, in taking the trait approach, we would look at a competitive athlete and basically believe that no matter what the score, that athlete's going to compete hard. Now, is that true in all cases? No. And is it true that non-competitive people can actually be competitive in different situations? Absolutely. So there are some limitations to this approach because it's not always a good predictor of behavior, and because basically it does not consider the situational influences on an individual. There's been a lot of research in this area, and part of that research has developed into what's known as the Big Five model. Now let's take a look at the Big Five personality traits. Now this model is widely accepted amongst psychologists, and it's this model that contends that we all basically have these five major dimensions in our personality. And these dimensions and these essential traits are on a continuum. So you have on one end of the continuum will be something such as extroversion, and on the other end would be introversion. So let's take a look now. And if you can remember the word ocean, O-C-E-A-N, you should be able to remember these five personality traits. Okay, so first is openness to new experiences. And this has to do with being growth mindset, having a growth mindset, versus being stubborn or lacking that growth mindset. So that's the continuum for openness. Conscientiousness. Well, conscientiousness really has to deal with self-discipline, having some constraint and really striving for achievement, versus being negligent or lazy, not really, kind of being disorganized. Those are kind of on the other end of the spectrum of conscientiousness. Next, we have extroversion. This has to do with being, having enthusiasm about being in social situations. You're typically assertive. You have a high level of activity, versus introversion. And introversion means more reserved, kind of keeping to yourself, rather be not involved in social situations and kind of be alone. So that's the continuum with extroversion. Next, you have agreeableness. Agreeableness is really, about being amiable, having modesty and humility, versus being contentious or argumentative, right? So those are kind of that's the spectrum for agreeableness. And last is neuroticism. Neuroticism is that that propensity for anxiety. Maybe you feel a lot of depression or anger. Maybe even you have a lot of nervousness, right? That's your neurotic behavior, versus emotional stability. People that have good coping skills tend to have emotional stability. So to recap, you have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, as mentioned, there's been a lot of research in this area. And what does that research come to help us understand? Well, to put it in a nutshell, Research indicates that those who display on the spectrum more extroversion and conscientiousness, that's the excitement about being in social situations, and those desiring self-discipline and constraint, they have a positive correlation with physical activity. Now, the opposite is true for neuroticism. Those that are anxious or worried about how they may look, or worried that they're not going to be as good as the other people maybe in the group. The neuroticism correlates to a negative association with physical activity. So again, extroversion and conscientiousness leads to a positive correlation to physical activity, and then neuroticism in and of itself leads to a negative correlation to physical activity. Now let's take a look at the situational approach. Now, the situational approach contends that our behavior is largely determined by our environment or the situation that we're in. It has a large backing from the Bandura's theory on modeling and feedback. And the research in this indicates that we can actually change behavior in a situation by how we give that feedback or how we model behavior, which is in and of itself a good thing. But again, it's not a good predictor of behavior because, again, we are complex individuals. When looking at both trait and situational approaches, it's really important to find that middle ground. And that middle ground turns out to be the interactional approach. And it's that interactional approach that really allows for us to understand an individual based on multiple factors, right? And this, again, is the most widely accepted approach amongst psychologists today. Now, again, it contends that our behaviors are determined by both traits and situation. Using this approach is the best predictor of behavior, better than trying to use trait or situational by themselves. It does have limitations because, if we only took it as a one-time snapshot of somebody's behavior using this interactional approach, we wouldn't take into account the individual's subjective interpretation of an experience, because I hope you do the same, but you have an experience. If it's a good experience, you learn from it and you learn how to replicate that. And then once you replicate it, then you can improve on it. Now that we can identify 3 different ways of studying and 3 different viewpoints of personality, the trait, situational, and interactional approaches, let's take a look at the perfectionist personality. Now, are there different types of perfectionism? Do all perfectionism lead to bad outcomes? Does perfectionism lead to good outcomes? And how does perfectionism affect our behavior and performance? Now, perfectionism has been one of the most widely studied personality characteristics in sports psychology in recent years. And remember that perfectionism is multi-dimensional. It's not an easy thing to really, pick apart, but we're going to do our best to do that. It consists of various components, including setting high standards, feeling concern over mistakes, being highly organized, and it also has to deal with how we view the opinions of others, and do we worry about those opinions or thoughts of what others may think of us. Okay, so there are 3 distinct types of perfectionism. There is the self-oriented perfectionism, the socially prescribed perfectionism, and then the other-oriented perfectionism. Now, self-oriented perfectionism is simply how we hold our own selves to high standards independent of what others think or what other standards may be. And you hold yourself up to that standard, and it's an internal thing, right? It's an internal drive. Now, the socially prescribed perfectionism is basically the degree to which you perceive how others in their standards, how you hold up to their standards, right? So, for instance, one of the primary examples of a socially prescribed standard would be grades, right? We have a socially prescribed standard that A's are awesome and F's are terrible. And anywhere in between, you can measure yourself on a scale and you can compare yourself to others. And the standard is stated that, A's, you're great, you're acceptable, you're above acceptable, you're outstanding, and we're gonna measure you on that. And so somebody else has set that standard, and you're living up to that. So that's a socially prescribed standard. It could be, socioeconomics. It could be, the car you drive, the clothes you wear. Those are all socially prescribed standards. And so if you're dealing with socially prescribed perfectionism, how are you trying to measure up to what others think is the standard? So it differs from the self-oriented perfectionism is because you set your own standard independent of what others think. And this one is you're concerning yourself with what others think. Okay. Now don't confuse that with other oriented, right? Other oriented perfectionism has everything to do with how you set standards for other people, and when they don't measure up, you evaluate them based on your standards. So self-oriented is you evaluating yourself. Socially prescribed is you measuring up to somebody else's standard. And other oriented is you evaluating somebody else according to your standard, right? So with this other oriented, it has everything to do, and we hear about this in locker rooms. And Kobe Bryant was somebody that they've talked about this with, and so was Michael Jordan. They all had high standards of how to train, and the results were going to be championships, right? They all had the high standard of championship, but underneath that high standard was this idea that other people need to live up to my standards, and if they don't, they don't measure up essentially. So again, other oriented has everything to do with you personally holding some other individual up to your personal standards. Okay, now there's a paradox of perfectionism, right? What is a paradox? Right? A paradox is when two things can be true at the same time. And in this case, having a perfectionist personality can be both adaptive, healthy, or maladaptive, unhealthy. But it depends on several factors, right? And just to note, perfection in and of itself does not undermine performance. It's it's more related to your goal orientation. If you have a perfectionist personality, really then now you have to take a look at your goal orientation, and that has the greatest influence on your behavior and performance. As mentioned, there are many factors influencing performance: goal orientation, motivation, personality traits, task complexity, perceived ability, and perception of control are just a few of those factors that we can take a look at here in sports psychology. With goal orientation, really what we're talking about is, are you outcome goal oriented versus task mastery or process goal oriented? Process goal orientation or task mastery leads to better in performance. With motivation, we're talking really about approach motivation. Are you approaching a situation with enthusiasm, with excitement? This is known as motivation to achieve success. And really what you're after here is pride of achievement versus motivation to avoid failure. So this is the avoidance behavior that comes along with perfectionist behavior. And this is really has to do with the shame of failure. What are others going to think? When you worry more about what others are going to think, you tend to have a debilitation in your performance. Personality traits also have an impact, whether you're something like a low trait anxiety versus a high trait anxiety. If you're by nature have low anxiety, when you're put in a stressful situation, yes, your anxiety may raise, but not to a level to take you out of being able to perform well. Whereas if you have high trait anxiety, you put yourself in that same stressful situation. Now you've just elevated your high trait anxiety and may likely put you or bring you out of your optimal zone for performance. Next is task complexity. This really just has to do with, is it an easy or difficult task, and how well have you already mastered that task? That'll have a determining factor, as well as perceived ability. Do you have a high perception of your ability, or do you see yourself as not capable? And those all have an impact on your performance when it comes to the perfectionism within ourselves. And then last is our perception of control. Are these things in our control or out of our control? And being able to have a framework that allows for us to see how our personality and how our perfectionism impacts our performance will help us be able to change some of these behaviors that may be hindering us from being our best. Okay, so let's end with this. Let's talk a little bit about the research on perfectionism and some key takeaways. First off, it's important to remember that our perfectionistic demands can come from within ourselves or from others. That adaptive or healthy uh, perfectionistic behaviors tend to come from setting high standards, but where we don't worry about making mistakes and we really don't worry about what others think. That really is helpful when we're trying to improve our behavior. Because on the flip side, the converse is true. Maladaptive behavior, you have those same high standards, but all too often you have avoidance behavior and you're worried about making mistakes and you're worried about what others are thinking. The perfectionist standards do not, remember that the perfectionist standards do not automatically undermine performance. Again, with the right goal focus, you can actually lead to optimal performance. It's really debilitating when we use our performance as a self-evaluation. So it's really critical that we separate ourselves from having an outcome-driven mentality to more of a process task mastery driven outlook on our performance. Okay, a couple other things to note here is that your perfectionism was built into you by your parents most likely. It's really highly correlated to how they in their perfectionistic behaviors, were they maladaptive or adaptive in their perfectionistic behaviors? The research indicates that your predisposition to having the adaptive, the healthy or the unhealthy view of perfectionism or the outcomes on your behavior are really related to your parents. And lastly, those that are at risk, the most at risk for having a poor performance based on having this idea of the paradox of perfectionism are those with poor coping skills, a low perceived ability, they're ego oriented, and they tend to need their outcomes to satisfy some form of self validation to make them feel good about themselves. So these are the kind of things that we want to avoid when we are working with ourselves and with others. And we have strategies that we'll discuss throughout this semester on how to change or how to guide people to build confidence, to have a higher perceived ability, to improve their coping skills, to be less ego oriented and more task oriented. And lastly, to take out the need for self evaluation based on performance, but rather effort and attitude and a growth mindset. Thank you for your time, energy, and effort in this module. If you have any questions, please let me know.